So I think Dead Space 2 is probably one of my favorite games ever. The best way I can describe it is it takes everything that makes Dead Space 1 great and just cranks it up to 11. I prefer almost everything in this game to the first one, and I say that as someone who absolutely loves the first one and thinks very highly of it. Dead Space 2 picks up about 3 years after the first game. At the very beginning of the game, Isaac Clarke is broken out of a mental institution and realizes that there's yet another necromorph outbreak happening. Rather than taking place in a single spaceship, this game takes place in the Sprawl, which is a city on one of Saturn's moons. I think the name The Sprawl is probably a reference to Neuromancer by William Gibson, which is one of my favorite books. The game is all about Isaac struggling with his space dementia and seeing hallucinations all over the place of his dead girlfriend Nicole, who died on the USG Ishimura before the start of the first game. In addition to the dementia, Isaac also is trying to destroy a marker that was built after the first game. So to start off, I wanted to talk about the gameplay. The gameplay is just leagues better in this one than it is in Dead Space 1. And Dead Space 1 isn't shabby at all, but in Dead Space 2 everything just feels so much smoother and so much more refined. The best example of this I can think of is your stasis tool, which allows you to freeze enemies midair. In the first game I feel like it wasn't that useful in combat except for on the vibrators, or that sounds bad, the guys who moved really fast. But in this one it's useful on just about everything. Another improvement is that your telekinesis beam is so much more useful. You're able to pick up spikes and impale enemies with them more easily, and it's just all around really useful whenever you're low on ammo. Almost every enemy type from the first game returns, and there are a couple new ones such as the Spitter, which vomit up acid onto you, and there are also exploding babies, which is about as screwed up as it sounds. There are just all these huge incredible action set pieces. Several times you'll have to fight enemies while upside down, and there are a ton of zero gravity sections in this, which I think are done way better than they were in the first game, because you're actually able to fly through space and whatnot. Dead Space 2, like its predecessor, is very dark, and it's very clearly a horror game, but with that being said, I feel like it's more of an action game at times. I think a lot of this is due to the fact that, number one, you're playing as Isaac Clarke, who is a character who's already endured all of this before, and like I was saying, everything feels a lot smoother, which contributes a lot to the action game feeling, I think. The best way I can explain the difference between Dead Space 1 and 2 is to bring up Resident Evil. I think Dead Space 1 and Resident Evil 1 are pretty similar, just because in both games you're isolated to one area. In Dead Space 1 you're on the USG Ishimura for the entire game, and in the first Resident Evil you're in the Spencer Mansion. But in Resident Evil 2 you're exploring Raccoon City, and you're exploring the police station and the sewers and an evil underground laboratory, and you just go to more places basically. And it's the exact same thing in Dead Space 2. The areas in this are super varied. Like I said, Isaac Clarke starts off in a mental ward, and from there you kind of explore a bunch of apartments in the city, and you explore a Unitologist church, which is super cool to see, and you go through these crazy necromorph infested mines, and you end the game in a government building, so you're not stuck in this one place for the entire game. I love the fact that there are a huge amount of memorable scenes in this game. I think one of the most impactful is the return to the USG Ishimura from the first game. For reasons I won't get into, you have to go onto it for a bit, and so you explore a lot of the same areas that you explored in the first game, but of course they're different now. I think this area in particular could have been really bad if they had handled it really sloppily, or if they had not put any care into it, but it actually feels very respectful to the first game and very tasteful. Another memorable scene is whenever you go through a preschool, which is really screwed up because there are a bunch of zombie children and, like I mentioned earlier, exploding babies. Honestly, this entire section is probably one of the most screwed up things I've seen in a super big budget horror game like this, but it's also one of the most impactful sections in the game, I think. There's another section I love where you ride on a giant mining vehicle while fighting stuff off of it, which I think is super reminiscent of a scene in Resident Evil 4 where Ashley drives a giant crane car thing. I don't know, it's weird, but I feel like that scene in Resident Evil 4 definitely inspired this scene in Dead Space 2. One of my favorite things about the game is that it just flows. Like, I don't think there's a bad section of the game. Like I mentioned, there are a bunch of areas you go to in this game, and you don't stay in any one for too long, meaning that it never gets boring, but also more than that, every area is unique. I don't know how they did it, but everything about the pacing is just wonderful. There isn't any section of the game that I dread playing. I love Resident Evil 4 more than most people, but even I have to admit that the island section isn't that great. But with Dead Space 2, they just absolutely nailed it. Every part of this game is engaging and essential. One thing I have to mention is the gore in this game, because the first game is gory. You know, you're stomping on corpses and people are exploding and whatever else. And just like how they improved just about everything from Dead Space 1, they also improved the gore in this. I feel like the blood and guts in this is so much more intense and real looking. I mean, just look at the intro to this game. It shows the creation of a necromorph, and it's just the grossest thing ever. Like, a guy's face basically explodes. And that's how the game starts. Like, that's basically the first thing you see. In addition to that, there's a scene that features a needle going into Isaac's eye, and the eye machine has literally the worst, most disgusting death scene I have ever seen in a video game. In fact, it's so bad that I don't even want to play it here. Every time I've gotten that death scene, I've just been startled and absolutely horrified. One of my favorite things about this game is the fact that they gave Isaac Clarke a voice. Gunnar Wright is the name of the voice actor, and he does a phenomenal job characterizing Isaac, because honestly, Isaac didn't have much of a character in the first game. He was just your typical silent protagonist. And Gunnar Wright does such an excellent job at making Isaac feel like an actual person this time around. I think the reason why it matters to me so much that Isaac has a voice now is because in the first game, when he didn't have a voice, all that you really did was you just followed people's instructions. You know, they would be like, Isaac, go to the engineering deck, Isaac, go to the med bay, Isaac, unclog this toilet, you know, and it's just kind of, it gets old after a while. And so in this, Isaac kind of fights for himself and has a voice. And he feels like a character that's actually deserving of respect and admiration. So I love the voice acting in this, and I think all of the actors do a really excellent job with their characters. But I can't help but feel like they're kind of elevating the script a little bit, because the story in this isn't bad by any means, but I don't feel like it's everything it could be. There are a lot of ideas in this I love. For instance, I love the idea of an evil government just wanting to build a marker, because it's like, you know, it screwed up like this one planet and this one ship in the first game. But of course, there are going to be some psychos who look at that and go, yeah, we need this. And so I actually kind of love the idea of Isaac having to destroy a marker again. And I think Isaac plays really well off of Ellie, who's a new character in this game. She's a space pilot who just happens to get caught up in this outbreak like everyone else. And I think she's a really solid, strong character. Honestly, I think the biggest problem I have with this game's story is the way that Director Tideman is handled. Director Tideman is the guy who's in charge of the city that you're in, and he's the main antagonist of the game. And so he's constantly like trying to stop Isaac pretty much, because Tideman wants to protect the marker and Isaac of course wants to destroy it. But Tideman never really feels like a threat. I think one reason for this is just because Isaac and Tideman meet once, and that's at the end of the game. This isn't like a Batman Joker scenario where they're constantly butting heads and they're constantly fighting each other and going up against each other. The only time you see Tideman throughout the game, with the exception of the one meeting I mentioned, is just whenever he's calling you up and voice chatting with you. And throughout the entire game, you're fighting necromorphs who are disgusting and horrifying. And so because of that, it's really hard to take Tideman seriously. He simply doesn't hold a candle to the monsters you're fighting. And Tideman doesn't actually seem to have much of a personality past wanting to stop Isaac. He just feels a bit like a flat character. And so because of that, it's hard to take him seriously as an antagonist. And so because of that, it's hard to feel any kind of tension or urgency in the story. Again, I don't think the story's bad, you know, not at all, but I think a couple things could have been done that just would have made it so much better. I said it's hard to feel a sense of tension in the story, and I think part of that is just because of Isaac's character. Again, I actually really like the way he's written in this game, and I think they do a really good job of establishing him as a character. But because of the fact that he's already gone up against necromorphs before, he's not scared ever, and he's transformed into a more traditional action hero type. Isaac even has a few one-liners in this game, like he's Leon from Resident Evil 4. And so because of the fact that Isaac is constantly talking to people, and because of the fact he cracks jokes occasionally, the game doesn't feel as intense or oppressive as the first game. I think one of the biggest things that was lost from Dead Space 1 to 2 is Dead Space 1's atmosphere. I find it much easier to feel involved in the first game and to feel like I'm actually on the USG Ishimura. And even though I love Dead Space 2, I don't feel like it absorbs my attention in the same way as the first game. Now, is the game completely lacking in atmosphere? Not at all. There are plenty of great horror sections in this game. I think part of the reason why Dead Space 2 isn't as atmospheric as the first game is just because its goals are different. I can't help but feel like Dead Space 2 has a much higher emphasis on fun. You know, and that sounds kind of crazy since these are video games we're talking about here, but Dead Space 1, like I said in my last video, feels like an experience, whereas Dead Space 2, in my opinion, has a much more arcadey feel to it. I think Dead Space 2 is much more playful than Dead Space 1. And again, my reasons for thinking that are everything I've outlined so far. Just the fact that the gameplay feels smoother, and Isaac Clarke is more of a character this time around, meaning that you get attached to him, and because it's lacking that aforementioned oppressive atmosphere, it just feels more enjoyable. I think that in some ways, Dead Space 2 is a kind of reimagining of the first one, and that sounds crazy because it's a sequel, but it's definitely not the same thing as the first game. Around the time Dead Space 2 came out, EA was trying to turn Dead Space into this huge multimedia franchise, and so they had novels, and they had comic books, and they had spin-off video games that I never played, and so I feel like you can kind of see that with this one. Dead Space was growing into something more than what it initially started as. And Dead Space 3 gets a lot lot of hate for being much more actiony than the other two games. And I think that you have to remember that the shift from horror to blockbuster action really started with this game. And again, I freaking love Dead Space 2. Like I've said, it's one of my favorite games ever, but it's not one of my favorites for the same reason that the first one is. One last thing I wanted to talk about is the dementia in this game. Like I said in the beginning of this, Isaac Clarke is struggling with dementia, and the reason why is because of the contact he had with the marker in the first game. And so throughout the entire game, he experiences really ghastly hallucinations of his dead girlfriend, and they're kind of, you know, ooh, spooky or whatever. I don't really find them that scary, to be honest. I find them kind of frustrating actually at times, just because a lot of them are QuickTime events, which I hate. And I really love the idea of Isaac having dementia and of him hallucinating, but I wish that the hallucinations were a bit more subtle. Towards the end of the first game, Isaac starts hallucinating and starts seeing his girlfriend whenever she's actually already dead, but you don't know that yet. But in that game, there are definitely some telltale signs he's hallucinating, such as the flickering TV screens, which are glowing with marker symbols. But with that being said, you really don't know that Nicole is a hallucination until you finish the game. But in this game, every hallucination is like a big thing. You stop the game to just see the hallucination pretty much. And I think there are some really cool callbacks to the first game whenever you go to the USG Ishimura part, but I feel like any other kind of hallucination is just really in your face. And so again, I just wish it had been more subtle like the first game. Pretty much anytime Isaac has a hallucination, he knows he's hallucinating. And so because of that, I feel like it's not as scary as it could be. I would love to have seen Isaac struggle with hallucinations that he didn't realize were hallucinations. I just feel like that's kind of a missed opportunity. But I think in the end, I feel similarly to the dementia as I do with the story, which is to say, I don't think it's bad or that it's poorly done or anything like that. But I just feel like there are a couple minor things that if they had handled a little bit differently would have made the game that much more scary and that much more intense. So anyway, yeah, this is my favorite of the Dead Space games, honestly. I think at this point I'm on my like 6th or 7th playthrough of it overall. And like I've said, everything is just so refined, everything's so polished. And so if you like action or you like horror, or if you like both, then this is the game for you. And I guess that's all I have to say. So thank you for watching.